Awesome. Thanks, man. Um, well, shoot, no one got any of that. Okay, let me start back over again. That's cool. We were just on the first question. Okay, so the first question we're going to get rolling with is how do you get started when you don't have any experience? So there's a couple of ways that I got started in the beginning when I had never photographed anyone before. Uh, how do you get comfortable in front of people, and how do you get them comfy in front of your camera? And I started just photographing anybody. So literally, a hostess in a restaurant, someone walking down the street, classmate, because I was still in college at the time. I would just go up to everybody and be like, hey, I swear I'm not trying to hit on you. I'm trying to get into photography. I've never really done this, but you have a cool look, and I'd love to get together and take some pictures sometime. And if you're not feeling it, then that's cool too. Here's my number. And I didn't have a website. I didn't know anything about anything at the time. I had some janky hot lights, literally like CFLs and those silver reflector dishes from Home Depot, and then my first DSLR. And I knew nothing about anything. But I would just go ask people, and eventually people would say yes. It was actually easier than I thought. But I would always preface it with, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm trying to learn, and I think you have a cool look. If you want to, cool, and if not, that's great. Just put it out there. Let them know. You can't go in and be like, yo, I'm this awesome professional photographer. I'll make you famous, and then produce garbage photos. Or just like never call them again because you're embarrassed by your work. Just be cool, and people be cool with you. And as you get better, they'll be excited to work with you more. And you never know what kind of friendships will come out of that. Another thing that really helped me get started in the beginning, I teamed up with this awesome boutique clothing store. I went in, met the owner one day. I'm like, hey, I like your stuff. We serve the same people. How can we help each other out? So I had this idea for like a runway day. So I brought in hair and makeup artists. We had some like champagne and snacky food, and I set my lights up inside the store with a backdrop. So women would come into the store, try clothes on, and get their photo taken with these new outfits. And then I'd show them the photos after I'd whip them up real quick, and they loved them, and they'd buy all of the clothes. So the store owner loved it because everyone that came in bought everything they tried on. I booked a couple of clients out of it, which was cool, so I got a little bit of money out of that. My hairstylist got hired to come and do hair and makeup on those shoots, so they got paid a little extra, as well as giving their cards out. But the real benefit to me was that experience of getting new faces in front of my camera. So they were really short sessions as people tried clothes on. So every 10 to 15 minutes, I'd have a new person in front of my camera. And I had to get them comfy in order to take pictures. Because, I mean, most of them were just like drop-in. They didn't plan on even showing up that day. So, yeah, working with them, get them comfy in front of the camera. You learn to build those skills as you try and you fail over and over and over again, and you just get better. You just treat people like real people, and it works magic. So those were some good ideas that helped me get started in the beginning. Team up with somewhere. You could also go to like a college campus, set up, do headshots for a day, just free headshots. Set up like a light and a little backdrop, or even against a wall. And when people walk by out of class or something, be like, hey, doing free headshots today. Just sign up if you want, and I'll email your photos later on. And just practice photographing people. And just be honest with your intentions, and people get on board. All right, what do we got next? All right, so Lex wanted to know about how do you avoid glare on glasses when shooting with strobes. Now this one's tricky because unless they're using museum quality glass in their lens frames, which nobody does, you're almost always going to get glare. The only real way to counter this is to change the angle of the light, especially because lenses are spherical. Even in glasses, they might not be as curved as a contact, but they're still spherical. So you have to just keep adjusting the angle of your light and the angle of your subject's face until you can get good light on them and you don't get the nasty glare. I always ask people too, like, do you wear glasses 100% of the time or some of the time? And we'll often do the same round of headshots with and without glasses. And I'll let them choose at the end. But that's an easy way to avoid the situation altogether. If they only wear them part-time, maybe they don't even want them. Sometimes people want to wear glasses to look smarter. So you just have to be prepared and be like, hey, I just want to make these last little tweaks, get everything perfect, and get the best photo for you. Let them know that you know what you're doing and you're not just like fumbling around with your gear because you have no idea what's going on. But just tell them like, hey, I'm going to make these little tweaks. We're going to get it right. I don't want any glare in those frames, so let's do this. And they are 100% on board because they want their headshots to look good. Kurt asked about some Lightroom presets. This one's a little more in depth about how to apply them, how to set them, import them, export them, and whatnot. So I'm actually going to, probably in the next week or two, go through and I will make like a screen cap of me creating some Lightroom presets, how I use them, how I tweak them, layering different things. I think it's more in depth that I can answer here without actually showing you. It wouldn't do it any justice. But I'm actually going to go through and do my whole Lightroom workflow so you can see how I set up everything in Lightroom and why I can go through and edit, shoot of 60 images start to finish in 15, 20 minutes and have them look good. Then Aaron wanted to know, how do you know when you're done with an image? What is overprocessed and what is not? This is another one of those things, like it depends. There's no right answer. I mean, you can definitely look at some photos and definitively say, yeah, that is way over processed. Like when someone's skin is so smoothed out, they look like plastic, like they're a mannequin, or when the eyes are bleached white and they look like a zombie, that's bad. Same thing when you over sharpen the eyes. And there's a program called Portrait Professional, and it is known for being the cheap, easy way for photographers to edit their stuff in the beginning, but it's awful if you don't dial it back. So as long as you go into any skin softening or eye whitening or any kind of program like that, and just, they have sliders for a reason. So don't crank everything up to 100% and call it good. Dial things back to 0 and slowly start to increase your sliders so you can see, how good does the skin look? Am I just removing blemishes and red spots and shadows, or have I removed all pore detail? If you don't see pores in the skin, they don't look real. Even look at a makeup ad or any kind of beauty cosmetic advertisement, you see pore detail. And those things are photoshopped for hours. And they leave that in there because it has to be a real person. Oversaturation is another big thing. So Adobe has come out with this thing called Vibrance in the last few versions of both Photoshop, Lightroom, and I think RAW has it also. And Vibrance is great because you can boost the vibrance, how strong all the colors are in the image without oversaturating, where you lose detail in the colors, like how you can blow out a highlight or drop a shadow and clip it so that it goes totally black. You can totally do that with color values as well. And that's what adjusting saturation does. So a lot of landscape images, HDR, a lot of people will slide the saturation all the way up, but you're losing detail in the image and you just end up with these like gnarly, clunky blocks of color. And it doesn't look good. So again, start at the bottom and just gradually slide up your vibrance until you have something that looks good. Then bounce back and forth and you'll see where you started and where you came from. You can always go back if you work with layers, adjustment layers, things like that. Start small and then add it in. It's like salt when you cook. Too much, terrible. So a little bit goes a long way. And then you can always add a little bit more later on if you need to, but don't go overboard in the beginning. All right, what do we got next? So Alec was asking about strobes versus constant lights. Why you would choose one over the other. Now, Alec came along on the last workshop I did, and we used strobes out there in the field, but we were also talking about constant lights. So I'll go over this a little bit too. I'm using an LED panel right over here to balance the window on the side of my face. So one of the big uses for constant lights is video. There's two kinds of constant lights. One are hot lights. That's not like the factory name, but the industry calls them hot lights because the bulbs are generally really bright. They crank out tons of power and everyone ends up sweaty in front of them. They're really hot. The newest thing are LED panels, which new is a relative term. They've been around a while, give off virtually no heat. LEDs are awesome because you can raise and lower the power. You can adjust the color temperature. I can make this thing look like it's a sunset in here by warming it up all the way, but they're a lot more expensive. Constant lights are never as powerful as strobes because strobes, they fill up this capacitor, tons of power in that, blows through a flash bulb, and you can crank out tons of energy that if you try to put through a constant light would probably cook you like you're in an oven. Aaron, LED light recommendations. As far as like brands go, places to get them, most of them are pretty similar. I can't honestly say there's one brand I prefer over another. I would just look at the controls that you have as far as things like power, color, temperature, and then the output for them and figure out what you need. So you can go into most camera stores. I know I tested this one out before I bought it. And I just had like the guy at the counter hold it by his face and then move it away to see what kind of fall off was there. And if it's not even powerful enough to overpower the overhead lights in the store, it's probably not going to get the job done for you, especially unless you want to shoot at like f1.2 with your ISO at 1250 or something. So get something with some power because you can always dial them back down. That's the beauty of those things. Avoid hot lights. I know they're dirt cheap to buy them at Home Depot or whatever. Or those big like shop lights, you know, with like the basket cages on them. There's two of them mounted to a stand. They're like $60 or something like that. But you cannot control the shape of the light. I think some LED panels have like barn doors. I know mine does. So you can at least control the flood. So it's not just like a whole room full of light. You can just kind of aim it in. I'm not sure if some have soft boxes or not. They're already pretty soft, or you can just bounce it against a reflector and have the reflector throw the light back if you want to soften them a bit. But constant lights don't have the modifiers that strobes do. That's another beauty of strobes. You can do a snoot, a grid, a soft box, a strip box, umbrellas, whatever you want to do. Because it's such a quick burst of light, there's no heat buildup. So you can have all this fabric in front of your light and they're not going to catch fire. So that's a pretty cool thing too. But the LEDs are pretty handy. I carry this one on shoots even when I don't use constant lights, because if we're out shooting sunset, last light or whatever, it's cool just to like prop one up so we can see what we're doing out there. And they're pretty cheap, they're lightweight compared to, you know, any big industrial lights. We can pack this thing around, clip it to my tripod, and it's definitely lit to nighttime shoots for us, so we're not just tripping around in the woods falling into things. Tons of questions this week about lens selection. What is the best lens for a given type of shoot? It depends. This is one of those things where it's good to know all the rules so you know how to break them properly. The main issue that came up was using wide angle or some kit lenses like the 18 to 55 that comes with most DSLR, like the starter cameras. Why aren't those good for portraits? Why does it make everyone's face look all wonky? And the answer to that is wide angle distortion. And when you shoot wide angle, that is, you know, 10 to 25, 10 to 35 millimeters focal length, you get this like, you know, round fisheye effect. And the reason that it makes faces look wonky is because as things travel like from your lens and they get farther away, they get exponentially smaller viewed through the lens. So normally you would look and see someone's like nose to ear ratio, like we see people every single day, and our eyesight is about 50 millimeter for reference. So when you go wide angle, it makes it look like the ears are considerably farther away than the nose because things grow smaller exponentially. So instead of looking like they're this far apart at a 50 millimeter, if you were to switch over to like a 17, they'd look way farther apart, which means they're a lot smaller. So somebody's face will look like way stretched back or really rounded depending on your angle. So wide angle is not good for close-up portraits. With that kit lens, you can zoom into 55 millimeters, and since you're on a crop sensor, you're at like 75 to 78 millimeter, which is a pretty good focal length for portraits. So generally wide angle, which is anywhere from 10 to 35 millimeter, is used for landscapes, for architecture, I use them for my portraits because you get this big sweeping epic look. But the person is just one element in the entire photo. It's not just a shot of a person. Then you move on to your standard focal length, which is 50 millimeters. And that's really anywhere between 35 and about 75 is your standard focal length. And that's great for portraits, for products, also street photography. When you're walking around photographing people, crosswalks, on a bench, any kind of street photography is generally 35 to 50 millimeter, just because it's how our eyes see it. So if you're doing street photography, it's to create, a day in the life of a city or a town. You're capturing what it's like to be there in that city. And so you want to keep the view and the perspective what we would see through our eyes normally. That's why we choose that one. Then we bump into the telephoto range, and that's like the 85 to 150, 180-ish. And these kind of zoom lenses, again, called telephoto, they are generally good for portraits because a longer focal length will give you a really shallow depth of field. You can jump back to my video from a couple weeks ago about depth of field. I talk about that a little bit more. They're good for product photography because you can get in nice and close, which leads us into macro photography, which some of the best macro lenses are about 100 millimeters, 135 up to 180, around there. So we've got wide angle, good for landscapes, for architecture. You got standard, great for street, for portraits, for products. Then we got telephoto, great for portraits, also good for products, and then macro. And then you've got super telephoto, which is like 200 all the way until they don't make them anymore. And these are good for things like wildlife. If you're photographing lions, I don't want to be right next to the lion. I want to be far away from the lion. Also doing sports, because generally you can't stand on the football field or on the baseball diamond while they're playing. You got to be a little ways away. And unless you want a whole sweeping scene of the field, if you just want to get one tight shot of one player, you got to zoom all the way in. So super telephoto is going to give you that, especially when you put that on a crop sensor. Then it'll magnify it by 1.4 or 1.6 depending on your sensor. You can get in pretty tight. I mean, some of these lenses go, 600, 800, 1200 millimeters and up. On a crop sensor, you're at almost 2000, which is nuts. You can zoom in and see somebody's thoughts just about. But again, knowing what they used for and what they do to the image will allow you to play with them and break the rules. So I shoot a lot of my portraits at 17 millimeter, but I still keep my headshots to 85 because I love my sharp 85 prime lens, but you get really cool sweeping epic shots with that wide angle. Play around with it, find out what you like, find out what you don't like. You'll find that if you photograph people wide angle and their arms are out a little bit, their arm will be like really long, kind of like how it is in this video right now compared to kind of how it should be back here. And people end up with all these wonky limbs and weird faces, but you learn how to position them in the photo and it can look pretty cool. What's next? Oh, and then how to fix wide angle distortion in post-production. So say you've taken some photos, they looked okay in camera, maybe at that 18 to 35 millimeter range, but now you want to fix it. Photoshop is a pretty cool lens correction tool. So does Lightroom. Lightroom even has lens profiles. So you can go in and say, I shot this with a Canon 16 to 35 millimeter lens, and I want you to fix it. And it'll fix your vignetting, the barrel distortion. It'll fix chromatic aberration. It knows the strengths and weaknesses of like all of these great lenses, Sigma, Canon, Nikon, Olympus, Zeiss, all of the major lenses are going to be in here. And it will warp the photo to reduce that distortion as well as fix the other things that come along with it. So Lightroom, Camera Raw, and Photoshop have those for sure. I would imagine that Apple's product comes with it. Capture One, I'm sure, does as well. It's pretty standard. You can't totally fix it 100%. Sometimes you might have to crop in to stretch things out and you'll lose a bit of the frame. But you can do a pretty good job at it. but I think making those mistakes once will teach you to never make them again. And then next time you'll choose a better focal length and save all that time in post-production. Okay, so we've talked about watermarks a lot in the last week as well. And this is one of those things that everyone's got a different opinion on it because they serve a purpose, but they also get in the way. It's a fine balance. So I would suggest if you are going to stick a watermark on your photos, drop it in one of the lower corners because these are really meant to identify you as a photographer. It's not an anti-theft device because if someone wants to steal your photo, they'll steal it. And if they're just going to clone out your watermark, they'll do a pretty good job of that. There's some crafty people with Photoshop. So keep your watermarks to a minimum. They get very distracting when they're big and when they're in bright letters with these crazy scripty fonts. It really takes away from the image. And if you have a great photo, the last thing you want to do is ruin it by sticking your name in big letters right in the middle. So one of the things that I learned from the old print competitions I used to go to is to find the most identifying elements of an image is to hold it upside down. So take your photo, walk away from it for a minute, come back and flip it upside down. And that way you're seeing the photo as merely shapes and colors and highlights and shadows. And your eye will naturally go to the most prominent thing in the photo. And if it's your watermark, then you got to fix that because you don't want your viewers observing your work because they admire your watermark. You want them to like your photography. So if you got to stick your name on it, just drop it in like a little corner right down here and make it small. You can even adjust the opacity. So I know on times where I've put watermarks on mine, I'll drop the opacity of that watermark to like 50% so it's not as bright, or I'll save different variations at 10%, 25, 50, 75, 100% opacity. And then I'll just drop them in depending. So really dark photo doesn't need a bright watermark. I'll pick like the 10 or 25% opacity PNG to go over that photo. That way it's not overpowering all the other elements in your image. But really, you don't need watermarks. People steal your work if they're going to steal it. And if you just develop a unique style and you have your name in the credits and listed everywhere else, then people know how to find you because your image will be there. Do we have any other questions for right now before I move on to the last one? No? Okay. The last one we had for the day shoot, I didn't write it down, but I remember what it was. It had to do with adding textures over images. So I had uploaded one earlier, I think yesterday, and did a fantastic job of overlaying this texture over an image. The one thing I recommend when always doing this, and Sai, you totally nailed it, do not overlay texture over skin. So we can go over clothes, background, whatever else, but just try and avoid going over the skin if you are playing around with things like that, or you can dial it way back. So use a layer mask, drop down to like 10% opacity, and then apply your texture over the skin, because the way that we perceive texture in an image, we want skin to look like normal skin. And if you want to modify it, then go nice and easy with it. And again, start small and then dial up your opacity on the texture of the skin. Because you'll find that, say, your overlaid texture at 60% looks great for your background. It's probably around like 10 to 15% for skin. Depends on the photo, depends on the texture, but generally dial the skin way back. And don't cover up the eyes, mask little things off, drop the opacity a little bit more. That's generally how you're going to get the best looking image when you're overlaying your textures. And the last thing I've noticed coming up in the last few days, horizon lines. So whenever you're photographing anything with a horizon line in it, keep that level. I've seen a couple posts in the last few days, and it was awesome that you're all getting out to shoot. But when you have a horizon that's tilted and you're looking at that photo, it makes me feel like I'm going to fall over. because our eyes need to see a horizon as level. And if we don't like that, there's some kind of cognitive dissonance. Our brains don't register it. It's like if somebody's skin is purple and we know it's not supposed to be purple, or you get some photos that have like the mystery hand reaching over somebody's shoulder or around somebody's back, and you can't identify where those fingers come from, it throws your brain off. So if you select your different autofocus points in the camera, there could be 9, there could be 64, anywhere in between, it'll give you that grid where you can choose all of your autofocus points. Those are totally squared off. So if you just get that little screen to pop up on your camera, you have all these dots appearing, you can use that as your level, line those dots up the same row with your horizon line, and then you can make sure your photo is level. A lot of cameras also come with a level on them. My tripod has a level on it, or you can do it in post-production. When you crop, it'll actually bring a grid across your photo, and then you can rotate the image until your horizon matches perfectly with one of those grid lines. You might lose a little bit having to crop the photo, but it's going to be a lot more user-friendly than having a tilted horizon in your image. All right, Sister Deep, what do we got? What's the best medium format for the money to get right now? Oh, I don't shoot medium format. I know that Hasselblad backs are fantastic. They're kind of an industry standard. So there's the medium format body, and then you put different backs on them. So you can do a film back, you can do digital backs, there's colors, there's black and white, different resolutions as well. So it's really the best for what you're doing, and like all other camera gear, try and buy it used if you can, especially with the medium format, because they get to be crazy expensive. And medium formats are best when you're doing really, really large prints or crazy detail and product photography. So it's a pretty hefty investment to get into one of those. So I think you can get an amazing full frame DSLR that can do probably 99% of everything a medium format can. It just loses a little bit of that dynamic range and also a little bit of the resolution. But again, Hasselblad is the industry standard, and I know there's a store here in the Bay Area called Bear Imaging in Palo Alto, right near Stanford University. They have different backs in there. You can actually go in and try them all out and test drive them. So that might be a thing. See if your local camera store has them, or if there's, I don't know, maybe it's drive an hour away to a big city if you're not in a big city. But that, I would say that would be your best bet. Anyone else? All right, well, let's wrap things up then. I'm going to insert a little PDF that I just made that covers what the different kinds of photography work best for different lens selections, just in case you have any questions. But you can always ask more questions, post them in the forum, shoot me an email. It's ask@photogsunite.com. You can put them here in the group, you can message me, and I will get to them next Monday at 6 o'clock. This is going to be a regular weekly thing, and I promise I'll have sound from the get-go next time. So thanks, Aaron, for pointing that out for me. And we'll also be having part 1 of the video lighting series, or studio lighting series, coming out later on this week. I'm working on recording that now, and we're going to be covering different types of lights that you can use that aren't the sun. I just pointed to the sun even though I'm indoors, but you get what I mean. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm here for you. Keep shooting and strive to be a better photographer.